Glad to see all of you here. Thank you so much for your study, and thank you for your so much hanging in there with us through Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. We've studied a lot. We're starting tonight in Numbers chapter 28, and I'm not sure exactly how far we're going to make it through here tonight. We've also got to remember we're getting close to, this is about the second week of November. We will not be meeting Thanksgiving because it's going to fall on that day, so keep that in mind. So we'll be out that week. So we've got about one, maybe 2 more weeks before Thanksgiving, and then after that we'll pick up and maybe meet about 3 more times after that. So we've also got to spend some time in Deuteronomy, obviously. So we've got a lot of ground to cover, and I just appreciate so much your encouragement of me as I'm trying to teach this class, because I have taught Numbers and Deuteronomy before. I've taught Deuteronomy by itself before, but Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy has been a challenge for me, but I've grown a lot, and let me encourage you, as you're studying the Bible, always force yourself to learn something more. The more you know, the more you understand, the more you can then grasp why God does what he does. And always, let me just encourage all of you every way that I can to just keep on wanting to know more and more and more of God's will. So we're going to begin, like I said, tonight in Numbers chapter 28. And it's going to kind of sound like, as it was in one sense, it's going to kind of sound like a repetition again of the offerings. But we've got to remember the different contexts here. What's happening here is, again, he's preparing, is at the end of the 40-year time frame, and they're getting everything prepared for going into the land and actually doing what needs to be done afterwards. So when he starts giving you and talking about all these daily offerings, yet again, we get to thinking to ourselves, man, we've read this before, we've seen this before, we've tried to understand why he keeps emphasizing this idea, because again, God wants it right so that we might come into the presence of God. So with those things in mind, let's begin with a word of prayer. I'm grateful, Father, for this day and for the opportunity you give me to teach this class. I'm thankful for every person that's taken this class, and I pray that you please be with them in whatever struggles and difficulties and trials that they're having right now. Also, Lord, in the joys that they're having. Lord, this has been an interesting year. And Father, we've had to adapt to a lot of different things, and some of us more than others. We continue to pray for Rosalind and the loss of her husband, and ask you, Father, to continue to be with her. We pray for Rex as he's traveled to Arizona, and we ask, Lord, that he might be well out there. We pray that we might always put you first in our lives. And as we said a moment ago, Lord, do the very best we can to know more of your will each and every day of our lives. Strengthen us and be with us. Take care of us. We humbly ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen. So we start off again with the daily offerings. And we've like I said, we've studied this before in Leviticus chapter 3, Leviticus chapter 21, and here again in Numbers chapter 28. And so he starts talking about exactly what is going to be required of that. I'm not going to go over the details of that again because of the fact that we've already seen this before. But what I will do at the end, and James Smith in his commentary on the Pentateuch, and actually it's a very small commentary. It's maybe 400 or 500 pages long, but it just hits the highlights, brings out the ideas, and he actually does the math of figuring out over a period of about a year how many animals would be sacrificed to God during that time frame. He will also emphasize in chapter 28, verse 9, on the Sabbath day, 2 lambs in their first year without blemish, 2/10 of an ephah of fine flour. This is the burnt offering for every Sabbath. So every day, they start off the day with a lamb being sacrificed, and they close the day. I mean, that seems like that is constantly burning, day and night. On the Sabbath, 2 lambs are the first year. The monthly offerings, at the beginning of your months. Now, what I found interesting, and I tried to bring this out, and if I haven't done this, please let me know, especially those of you that are online, but the Jews had 2 separate calendars. One was what we call the, religious calendar, and then there was the other that was, you might consider to be more of the other kind of calendar. So the calendar that we're associated with. So you see this The religious calendar started on the month of Abib, and the first part of that would be honored by the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and we remember that. The civil calendar would be the month of Tishrei, which was about 4 or 5 months off from the other one. You would have the blowing of trumpets, or the Rosh Hashanah, the Day of Atonement, which is also known as the Yom Kippur. And so as you start looking at this and reading all of this in details, the offering at the Feast of Weeks, the monthly offerings, the offerings at the Passover, and all of this, here's what you need to try to figure out. Now, over the course of a year, the lambs that would be killed for the daily offering, just the daily offering, would be 728 lambs over the course of a year. Okay, no, this would be the burnt offerings that they would be required to make to God all the time. So it wouldn't be just every person. This would be making these particular lambs on behalf of the whole nation. Okay. On the Sabbath day, you would have to add an extra 104 lambs, because why? Because you have 2 lambs on the Sabbath day that would be sacrificed, morning and evening. At the time of the new moon, they would sacrifice 8 cows, 8 bulls, 4 rams, 28 lambs, and about that same time, they would also have a sin offering of about 4 of them around the new moon. For the unleavened bread, there would be the Feast of Unleavened Bread. It'd be 2 bulls a day for 7 days, which would be 14 bulls, 7 rams, 49 lambs, and again, the offering, the Pentecost would have 2 bulls, 1 ram, 7 lambs, and again, 1 for the sin offering, the atonement. The Feast of Tabernacles, the Feast of Weeks, okay? This starts up in chapter 29, and you'll notice, you shall offer a burnt offering for a sweet offering for the Lord, 1 young bull, 1 ram, 7 lambs in their first year without blemish. And then goes through that in the Feast of the Trumpets, the offering of the Feast of the Tabernacles in verse 12, of chapter 29, emphasizes you start off with 13 young bulls, then every day you go down a bull, every day, and so the next day would be the 12 bulls, then 11 bulls, and then 10 bulls, all the way down through that whole course of time. So to make a long story short, over the course of a year, just 4, now this isn't including the people's sins offering or the burnt offerings that they would offer, but just for the whole nation, there would be 97 bulls killed, 29 rams killed, 1,035 lambs killed, and 22 killed for the sin offering through the course of the year. Now that's just the course of the year, and that doesn't even begin to include, all the other sacrifices that the children of Israel would be making every day for their own sins. Okay? So, the thing that I want you to see, and it's like one brother told me years ago, if you prick the Bible, it's going to bleed, because it's just full of blood everywhere. So it's important for us just to realize how blessed we are and how Jesus took care of all of that with his blood. His blood was perfect. He had to be the perfect sacrifice. But just again, to realize what all would be involved in doing that. Okay? That would be a whole nother emphasis there. All righty, we're going to chapter 30. Any questions on chapter 29? Like I said, I'm not going to spend a lot of time there because we have looked at this over and over and over again. So let's go on to chapter 30. Then Moses spoke to the heads of the tribes concerning the children of Israel. This is the thing which the Lord has commanded. If a man makes a vow to the Lord or swears an oath to bind himself by some agreement, he shall not break his word. He shall do according to all that proceeds out of his mouth. So the ideal is that the first thing you begin to look at here is that whatever we say, when they made a promise at that point in time, they could not break it. And again, think about today, you know, the Bible will emphasize the idea that we don't need to be making promises that we're not willing to keep. So that necessarily means as Christians, we need to be very careful about what we promise people we will do. And we need to do the very best we can to make sure we're living up to those promises. What happens if we don't keep our promises? What happens if we don't keep our vows, as it was? Yeah, well, obviously, as you look at the consequences here, he shall do, notice he says, if you make a vow, he shall not break his word. He shall do according to all that proceeds out of his mouth. Then he starts talking about the women and the vows that they make. But the bottom line out of all of this is you had to keep your vows. You had to keep those promises. There was a difference between just anybody making the vow and a woman making a vow. If a person, if a woman makes a vow to the Lord and binds herself by some agreement while in her father's house in her youth, her father could say, no, you're not going to do that. And he would overrule her that day he hears it. And so in essence, the only way she would keep those vows is if her father kept it, you know, if he just was quiet, said, no, you need to be doing that, okay? Otherwise, it could be unbound. And again, the ideal is the Lord will release her because her father overruled her. If she takes a husband while bound by her vows or by rash utterance, and the husband hears it and makes no response on the day that he hears, then her vows shall stand. But if her husband overrules her on the day that he hears it, he shall make void her vow which she took and when she uttered with her lips, by which she bound herself, and the Lord will release her. So this, to me, kind of goes back to the idea. Think about the two or three things he's emphasized here. When he's talking about men, all men are to keep their vows, promises, no matter what. When he was talking about women, women were living in subjection, going back to the beginning of Genesis, whenever Genesis chapter 3, when man sinned. So we understand that she was going to be in submission to her husband and make sure she did what God wanted, and the husband could have the opportunity, if he wanted to disavow the vow. If a woman was divorced or a widow, she had to keep her word. So again, all the things that we're emphasizing right here, we understand that God was making it clear that, again, when you make promises, you have to keep those promises. Listen to what Jesus will say in Matthew chapter 12. Matthew chapter 12, verse 36 and 37. Most of us may remember this, and I know you're going to hear what it's been said. I know you've heard something about it before, but let's just read it. 36, 37. But I say to you that for every idle word men may speak, they will give account of it in the day of judgment. For by your words you will be justified, and by your words you'll be condemned. Now, think about the importance of that today. Think about marriage vows and how easily they're broken nowadays. Think about vows and promises that we make to God. God, if you let me live, then this is what I'll do for you. And then we'll get out of that situation, or we'll get out of that in some way or another, and we'll sit back and say, well, you know, I made that a rash vow. I didn't mean it whenever I said it. Don't say it. Just don't say it. And you see, Jesus was trying to emphasize that same idea that Moses is trying to get across here today. What would happen if our world today, if we could truly believe everything everybody was saying? It would make it a lot better, wouldn't it? It would have to be. If everybody was saying the truth and trying to live up to what they were going to do, it would be such a much better world than what it is today. So there's that idea in chapter 30. And again, it's a very important lesson for each and every one of us as well. In Numbers chapter 31, they're getting close again to the battles. They're actually going to start fighting, and we remember especially this happened in the book of Joshua. But before that actually happens, we're going to find in chapter 31 where God demands vengeance on the Midianites. Now, we had just got finished reading last week, or I had gone through this with the prophecy of Balaam and Balak and how they wanted the curse there. And some people emphasize the idea that the Midianites and the Moabites are two different groups of people, but really they have all come from the same family. We emphasize that as well, okay? So the things I want you to look at as we're going to really start talking about some things that a lot of skeptics use to try to say, God, I wouldn't want to serve a God like this, okay? So in chapter 31, take vengeance on the Midianites for the children of Israel. Afterward, you shall be gathered to your people. So now he's talking to Moses. Moses, you're going to be dying. And think about that from that respect. I think some of us, what would we do if we knew that we were going to die very shortly? Would we change living our lives in any way? Would we do anything different? Oh, yeah. Yeah, if I knew I had 6 months, then I think I would look at some things differently. You know, I look at my whole life differently and what can I do in the next 6 months? Now, this is exactly what's happening with Moses here. The Lord said, you take vengeance on the Midianites, and afterward you shall be gathered to your people. And so what we're reading is coming at the very end of that 40 years. Moses is not going to be allowed to enter into the land of Canaan because of the sin that we've studied back in Numbers chapter 20. And so what we're going to actually read in Deuteronomy is a series of 3 speeches that Moses gives them, trying his best to encourage them to stay faithful. So, brother, anybody?
Yeah, I was going to say, what about when, when you have a discussion with a friend or child, wife, somebody like that, they say, well, I want to get back that, I want to get something like that, I want to get something like that. I would tell them, I mean, what I would say, I would tell her, no, don't do it. Because then you mind, says the Lord.
That's right.
I mean, that God takes care of them, not take care of them, fix it yourself. Do it. That's what I tell her. That's the advice I gave her.
Mm-hmm.
I said, don't do it. I said, let the Lord have my hand on him.
Yeah.
That's what you're talking about.
And that's, we've got to really think about it. We don't know the time we are going to be going, so we need to always be prepared, obviously. And we can't have hatred and evil in our hearts. So we've got to be very careful about that. So he says, arm yourselves for war and let them go against the Midianites to take vengeance for the Lord on Midian. Now notice, how does God look at this? When the Midianites and the Moabites had caused the children of Israel to sin by I'm trying to be as best as I can, but sometimes I don't know how I could do that, by the cohabitation with the Moabite women, okay, maybe for lack of a better term, okay, you know what I'm trying to say. This was against God. And again, sometimes I think, well, God's not bothered, or some people think God's not bothered by what I do. We fail to think about how God looks at sin. We fail to see the seriousness of sin, and we minimize sin to the point where, and we also take these ideas of God and say, well, God is so loving, he's not going to punish me for that. He's not going to punish us for anything. So what we begin to read here is how he is punishing people for their sins. And we really get bothered, especially a lot of people do, when he starts to saying, how far does this go? Okay? So what he said, 1,000 from each tribe. So here you have 12,000 of the children of Israel. No, they wouldn't. I'm sorry. So you're right.
But it does say 12,000.
Yeah. Well, maybe they did. Maybe they did. You're about right there. I would have a problem with the Levites doing that because, and I'll have to do some more study on that. I didn't cross my mind about that. But it seemed like their main job was taking care of the temple. If they had a...
Earlier, they weren't numbered among those who were eligible for war.
Right.
That makes you think like they weren't supposed to be going to war.
Right. There's that part. But then there's also the part as well, they would not be allowed to serve God if they had come around dead bodies. There would be a period of time where they would have to be cleansed before they could actually serve God. Now, you've got to also remember that part of the Levites actually carried the tabernacle and so forth, but then you've also got to realize that the part of that was obviously the priest, and maybe it wasn't part of the priesthood that actually had done that.
Those people that blew the trumpets were with them.
Yeah, yeah. And that may have been part of the tribe of Levi as well, more than anything else. Maybe they didn't actually get their hands, for lack of a better term, dirty by the war, but maybe they were leading out the people for that purpose. And again, when we go into the book of Joshua, we will see that it was the Levites who led the people going into that situation. And again, can we argue that the Levites actually engaged in killing anybody there? I don't know that we can, if they were going to maintain their purity to be able to serve God in that respect. So I had never thought about that, and I appreciate you bringing that up, Kerry. And I'll try to do more study on it if I can to see what. Yeah, and they may not. I mean, but it does say there's 12,000 from war, and he says 1,000 from each tribe of all the tribes. So you make a very good point there. And again, if anybody else wants to study on that, share that with us next week. Please do so. All righty. Moses sent them to war, 1,000 from each tribe. He sent them to war with Phinehas, the son of Eleazar the priest, with the holy articles and the signal trumpets in his hand. Now, there's another discussion here in verse 6, the holy articles. What did that include? The Ark of the Covenant? Did that include all the lampstands and all that other stuff? I don't know that we can make an argument about that. We do know that two of the holy articles would have been the trumpets, as you brought out just a few moments ago. So that may be all that he was referencing in that verse. But you see, we struggle with trying to understand it all. And notice you have Eleazar the priest, you have Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, with the holy articles and the signal trumpet in his hand. And again, the holy articles could have something, absolutely nothing to do with the tabernacle. I mean, absolutely nothing. But then we're left to try to figure out, well, what were they? And again, the Bible doesn't specifically say. So that's where we struggle with it. And a lot of these things, Moses and the children of Israel knew what they're talking about at that point in time, but I don't know that we can really understand all of it. All righty? Then they warred against the Midianites, just as the Lord commanded Moses, and they killed all the males. They killed the kings of Midian with the rest of those who were killed, Evi, Recham, Zur, Hur, and Reba, the 5 kings of Midian. Balaam, the son of Beor, they also killed with a sword. So Balaam got killed. Balaam was killed as well. So he says, the children of Israel took the women of Midian captive with the little ones, took as spoil all their cattle, all their flock, and all their goods, and they burned with fire all the cities that they dwelt in and their forts, and they took all the spoil and all the booty of all of man and beast. Now, here's where a lot of folks really start having problems. They killed everybody. They killed the men. Now, as we go on, when they return back, they bring back the captives, the booty, the spoil to Moses, to Eleazar. And Moses and Eleazar went out to meet them outside the camp. Why outside the camp? Because the camp was holy, and they could not come in until they had purified themselves and everything. And Moses was angry with the officers of the army, with the captains over the thousands and over the hundreds. And he said, have you kept all the women alive? So look, these women caused the children of Israel through the counsel of Balaam. Now we now understand. Here's the rest of the story. What caused them again earlier to engage in this? Balaam had encouraged the Moabite women to have relations with the men. And he says, there was a plague among the congregation of the Lord. Kill every male among the little ones and kill every woman who has known a man intimately. Now, there is that question. And we're going to see this problem coming up when we deal with Joshua, where entire cities were annihilated. every person in the city was killed. And some people today say, well, I can't believe in a God that would demand that. Let's talk about that for a few minutes, all right? Let's be honest enough to think about this. We have to realize that this is inspired by God. And God was the one who obviously gave the commands that this be done. But when we sit back and say, well, God would never have commanded that, or if he did, I don't want to serve that kind of God, we're questioning God's morality. True or false? Did God give this command? Absolutely. So now we have to come to grips with, how can God truly do that? And what I have come to, and James Kaufman in his commentary brings this idea out a lot better than I do. Let me encourage you to read that. But I'm trying to sum up a lot of the things that he brought out. Whenever men sit back and judge God, they act like they are superior to God, because why? No God that I want to serve would ever command that people be slaughtered this way. The thing is that, do what? Including innocent people. Innocent people. And I'm using that term in a, you know what I'm trying to say in that respect. Like all the young children. Yeah, young children. So the question pops up now, why did God give this command? How do we deal with this? Number one, I want to emphasize to you that they're trying to say that my morality is higher than God's morality as is portrayed in Scripture. But you see, we don't see things like God sees things. We don't see the tragedy of sin like God sees the tragedy of sin. We live in a sinful world, and it's so prevalent around us that we don't even bat an eye about it anymore. We have it fed to us through the television all the time that adultery is okay. You name the sin, it's okay nowadays, right? And I'm just being as honest as I could be about it. Homosexuality, there's nothing wrong. You can't condemn people that are, quote, in love with one another. And yet God does, Romans chapter 1. And as we also saw through the book of Leviticus, you shall not lie with a man as you would a woman. So all these things come into play. And in essence, supposedly these folks are more moral than God is. But that brings us back to the idea, what is our moral standard? When we as human beings become the moral standard, when we sit back in judgment of God as to why he did do such or why he commanded such, then we are claiming superiority to God. We become God.
That's why I was talking to my daughter one time. She would ask a question. She would say, "Well, Dad, why did God do this? Why did God do that?" I said, "Because he's God. That's God going on about his greater than ours because he's God." That's what she asked me.
And that's, yeah.
I told her that.
That's right. And you see, this is where a lot of, especially young people today, don't grasp this point, because again, we're not doing the teaching in the church. We don't ever sit around and talk about it to our young people about why God did this, right? So whenever they come confronted with things like this in colleges and stuff like that, they're willing to dismiss God because it makes more sense, because we, quote, have a better moral superiority than God, because we would never command people to be killed just that way. And that's just, you know, that's just wrong. It's wrong. It's wrong from looking at it. Would we judge God as harshly if he sent an earthquake? Would we judge God as harshly if he sent a flood? Oh, wait a minute. He did that before, didn't he? Would we judge God as harshly if he sent a disease to punish people? Oh, wait a minute. He did that as well, didn't he? You remember he struck them with plagues on a few occasions. And as I was typing this and as I was studying this and trying to think about it, I was thinking about how in 2020, here in Georgia, we've had COVID, we've had race problems. And again, we're saddened by that. We've had a flood come through here. We've had tornado and poor Louisiana right now. It don't seem like they get over one before they have to face another one, right? And of course, everybody will dismiss it saying what? Well, that's just the way it is. You know, they won't admit that God is the one that maybe sends these things. And that brings us up to another question. Did God make the world? Yes. Are these natural events going to take place? Yes, because God made the natural events. So the question is, do we, and here's where it comes down to it, and maybe this isn't the best answer in the world, but we've got to make a decision. Do we think we're morally superior to God, and that God, and I've actually heard people actually say this, God's going to have to answer to me for some of this stuff? No, he's not. But that is the height of arrogance. But we still struggle with this, don't we? The best explanation I could give you as I'm struggling with this and as I'm trying to deal with this is, listen, back in Genesis 15, 12 through 26, God is making a promise. Did I say Genesis 15, 12 through 26? I wrote it down wrong, it looks like, because they ain't 26. Yeah, I'm sorry. It's 12 through 16, okay? Genesis 15, 12 through 16. When the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Abram, and behold, horror and great darkness fell upon him. And he said to Abram, know certainly that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, and will serve them, and they will afflict them 400 years. Also the nation whom they serve I will judge. Afterward they shall come out with great possessions. Now, think about God's judgment upon the Egyptians, and specifically the death of the firstborn. Was that just? I think it was. Why? Because one Pharaoh sit back and said, what? You kill all the boys. You kill all the boys because we don't want them to grow and take sides with our enemies. You kill the boys. So God worked it out to where the death of the firstborn. But also you've got to realize that even in the midst of that, could Pharaoh have repented as he went through those plagues up to that firstborn? Were these plagues warnings to try to get him to realize that he's not in charge of things like he thinks he is? Could it be that God allows these things to happen a lot of times to us as human beings, to wake us up to the reality that there's someone else that we have to answer to? Absolutely. But he will go on to say this. He says, as for you, talking to Abram, you will go to your fathers in peace. You shall be buried in a good old age. But in the fourth generation, they shall return here, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. When it come to the flood, God destroyed the world because, why? The evil of man's thought was only evil continually. There comes a point, and we've got to make this point clear. There comes a point when God says, enough. I'm not going to tolerate this anymore. And it seems like, especially as you're reading the situation, that God is extremely merciful in how long he waits, right? How long has he put up with the children of Israel as we've gone through this from Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers? He's put up with them for a lot. And he's listened to their complaining and whining and everything else a lot, right? But he's also allowing them to go through this to become his people. But there comes a point when man has just actually sinned so much that God says, I can't deal with this anymore. I have to punish. It happened with a flood. It happened with Sodom and Gomorrah. It happened with, in this situation, these folks here with the Midianites. Why? Because they had engaged in the sin. The thing that I want to remind you is that God is just and right. And we have to share that idea. God is a God of love. God is a God that cannot stand the sight of sin. Habakkuk 1. we need to understand why he can't stand the sight of sin. Why is God so upset about sin? It's an affront to who he is. It's an affront to his character. Further, it's an affront to his mercy and his grace, because people keep pushing it and pushing it and pushing it and saying, God's going to let me get away with this. And he doesn't. And he never will.
That's an excellent point. I've not heard somebody say that before. That's an excellent point.
What's that? That
it's an affront to God.
it is an affront to God.
You know, I've always thought of it like, well, God's just so pure, he can't stand to be around sin. But it's not that. It's what you say.
Yeah. And, well, it's true in the fact that he can't because he is pure, but there's also that idea he's the one that gives the law. And so you break a law that God makes, and it's an affront to God.
You know,
Yeah, you're thumbing your nose at it. I'm going to do this anyway. I know better. I know more than God. And every person that judges these situations in the Bible, and like I said, here's the first one we're really coming to, when you go into Joshua and see them literally killing everybody in these cities like Jericho and so forth, with the exception of Rahab, we're sitting there struggling with this. How could God, but you see, we don't see sin like God sees it. Brother?
having this other thought when he killed the Moabites and the Midianites,
Mm-hmm.
but yet they reappear later.
Right.
It's like, how do they reappear if they were killed?
It was, in this particular situation, it was not the whole Midianites and the whole Moabites, okay? There were subsections all over, okay? And he was dealing specifically with that group of people that had been encouraged by Balaam and Balak to engage in sin with the Moabite women, as we've read here in Numbers chapter 31. So,
You didn't wipe out the whole nation.
no, he didn't. But we do see again, yeah, and that's it. Some people, looking at this particular circumstance as well, says, well, 12,000 men against all the Midianites? That couldn't have happened. That couldn't have happened. But the problem is what? God is the one that used his people to punish these people. And that's the thing that we've got to think about. In the Old Testament, God's people are the holy people. I'm using that term very loosely because, again, we know their problems, right? In the New Testament, what? We're not killing people because of their sin. We're trying to get people to be saved from their sin. Why? Because God is not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance. We remember also as well, think about the Midianites, going back again earlier. They had sinned against Israel, and they had sinned against God by deceiving them and encouraging them to sin in mating with the Midianite women or the Moabite women. Okay? How many of the children of Israel died because of that sin? Remember, God took out some of the people in the outskirts of the camp. 24,000. 24,000. Now, again, that really just begins to blow our minds. He's punishing his own people because they had the law, they knew what they should and shouldn't do, and they went ahead and did it anyway. Again, it was an affront to God. It was breaking the 10 Commandments. And so that's the reason why he did what he did. So here you have, again, in Numbers chapter 25, it's the Moabite women who had actually committed the sin, but they had done this at the instigation of the Midianites. I want to emphasize this. Israel was acting on the instructions of God. Nobody, no man today can claim that authority today. This was God's people being used by God to punish a group of people that had been engaged in sin. And God can do this in any way that he wants to. Now, as we as we again think about this, why? Why do we have such a problem with it? It's because we don't look at sin the way God does. We call it error, we call it mistakes, we justify it, any way we want to. We divorce our wife or we divorce our husband because we just love the other person, right? Love is all I need, right? Obviously, I'm joking a little bit. Where do we get that fed to us? TV, radio, all the stuff that we hear all the time. We don't look at sin the way God does. God is angry against arrogant and wicked men who rebel against his authority. And that's what it is. It's arrogance. And we're rebelling against God. Brother? You want to say something?
Yeah.
Okay.
We are those of us that confess Jesus Christ as our Lord and Savior and God the Father. Well, we are the children of God today.
Right.
We obey God. That's why when you get into it with somebody might disagree with you. So well, I don't believe that. But I said, well, read your Bible, we check it in the Bible, and see, to show it to them, read it in the Bible, see what it says.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, if you don't believe me, read God's word.
Yeah. That's the way it should be handled, right? But again, a lot of times we don't. And listen to this. Brother Kaufman made this point in his commentary. Refusal to reckon with the prerogative of a righteous sovereign God to judge sin and execute wrath upon it reduces God to something less than sinful man. In other words, if we don't look at God as being righteous and sovereign, righteous in the fact that he hates sin, sovereign in the fact that because he is God, he has the right to judge sin, then what are we doing? We're reducing God to below our level, right?
Would you think today that prior to judgment, God punishes some people today?
Yeah, I believe he does. Now, how? I don't know. I'm not going to sit back and say that's a situation of God's punishment. I've heard people actually go so far as to say that. I'm not going to be that presumptuous. We go through a hurricane or a tornado goes through a neighborhood. And God had allowed, because of these natural events, that to happen. And one person's house is totally obliterated and it kills the whole family, but nobody else is injured. Well, that's God's justice. Well, I can't say that for 100% sure. You know what I'm trying to say? Because I don't know the family. I don't know what they were engaged in. God knows. You know what I'm trying to say? And so sometimes we struggle with that. We try to point to these situations and say, this is the justice of God. And we've got to be careful.
Yeah, you can't really know. I'm trying to think, is there any example where we knew of something that I can't think of it? Like you say, okay, World War II, Hitler did all the concentration camps or anything.
Mm-hmm.
Did God take down Hitler, or did just natural armies take him down? We say God is in charge of the governments, but yeah, we have governments that do horrible things.
Mm-hmm.
That stay in charge of their government, even though they do horrible things.
Mm-hmm.
And the people in those government are supposed to respect that government, even though the government does horrible things.
Right.
And we're getting there.
Yeah, amen. And so here again, this is where the struggles really come in, because I think, yes, God is still in charge of governments, all of them. He's the one that set up Nebuchadnezzar, and he's the one that brought down Nebuchadnezzar. He's the one, Daniel chapter 9 emphasizes that. We understand that he's the judge of all the earth. Shall not the judge of all the earth do right? So yeah, God brings up governments. He brings governments down. He does all of that, but how does he do it? Think about what happened with Hitler. Think about how long the Third Reich lasted. Remember the 1,000-year Reich? The 1,000-year Reich lasted what? Started about 1937, whenever they elected Hitler to begin with, and it was over with by 1945. Okay, there was no 1,000 years there, right? But it did happen, but it cost millions of lives, literally. And so you're sitting there thinking, well, why didn't God just end it all right then? Because how bad it was. But again, we don't, whenever you're looking at, especially in the Old Testament, a lot of these nations, when they would go in and conquer another nation, they'd kill everybody themselves. So the justice that God would bring upon these nations, and especially these nations that the children of Israel are going to soon conquer, would be just retribution for what they had done to others. So we don't see the big picture. We just get the bits and pieces. We don't understand the huge picture of it all. And as a result of that, this is why we really do struggle with a lot of this, okay? So I don't know that I helped in answering these things, but I will say this. I will say, as I'm thinking about it, that we've got to get a grander view of God. That he's not just somebody there to, and this is where I think happens, and we try to bring out this idea a lot of times in the church, that he's just someone there to help us whenever we're dying or whenever we're sick or something. And don't get me wrong, he cares for all, each and every one of it. He cares for every person on that planet the very same way. But God cannot stand sin. Especially flagrant in your face, I'm going to do what I want to do anyway, sin. Anybody else got some other ideas here?
I'm thinking about what you're talking about, such as, when you talk to another person and you don't know the whole story, well, you just got part of it, because that's how people do it. Sometimes that happens. People say, well, they'll say this, and then I come in on the other part of it, I say, well, I didn't know that.
Mm-hmm.
You see?
Yeah.
I'm thinking I know everything, but I don't know everything.
Right.
And God is letting us know that we don't know everything.
That's right. We don't know all these things. We don't know all the sins that all these people have done. We know a little bit about Hitler's sins, but I still don't think we've even uncovered everything there. You know what I'm trying to say? And you name the dictator, and they're all there, okay? They've all committed sins, grievous sins. And there comes a point when God says enough is enough. And he uses other nations to punish these nations, right? World War I, World War II, and then we go into all this other stuff that's going on. There's a delicate balance in the world of all these nations right now, right? And I'm talking about because one of them could go off on the deep end in no time flat, and we'll be back in the middle of another world war. And again, will God bring retribution on those nations that do wrong? Absolutely. Because he's God. So it is a hard thing to sit down and discuss. But again, the points that Brother Kaufman makes are very valid points. Whenever we sit in judgment of God, we're claiming that we are better than God, that we know more than God, that we can make better decisions than God. And it's like you said, brother, a lot of times I jump to conclusions. A lot of us do, right? We hear part of the story, we jump to a conclusion, then and we sometimes mouth off, okay, before we know all the facts. And then we come to find out the facts later on, and it's like, oh, I wish I hadn't said nothing. I wish I'd have kept my mouth shut. And one thing that I'm beginning to find out as I grow older is I'm trying my best to listen to every side of the story before I make a conclusion. I try my best, and I think this is the heart of Jesus. You find in the Old Testament where God really comes down hard on these sins. But God is not the God of the Old Testament, and he's harsh and bitter and vindictive and wants to kill everybody. He's still the same God of the New Testament. And in the New Testament, he's emphasizing his grace through his son. But what had to happen for that grace to happen? Jesus' death on the cross. Part of the Godhead, taking on human being form and actually taking the penalty of sin. And so we sit back and say, well, God doesn't understand. Oh, yes, he does. Yes, he does. So again, it's extremely interesting to study this. I don't know that I've really addressed it to the point to where I could, but maybe it's given some answers. To me, again, it's all summed up in this one idea. We claim to know God, so we have to look at what the Bible clearly says about what he said about these situations and understand that there's more behind the scenes than what we think. Not only that, but as one brother said, and of course, here's where some other people are going to get upset. So let's suppose that they killed the male children. Now, why would they kill the male children? Well, again, think about it. Whenever you are living by the world standards and your parents have been killed because of sin and you grow up, you're not going to feel a very benevolent love for the God that commanded that, right? But you also think about the fact in the New Testament, he brings out the idea that the little children are going to be saved, right? So, and I don't want this to sound weird, but it's going to. In a sense, God is merciful to them in the fact that they don't grow up and then make those bad decisions to seek revenge or something like that. Is that weird? Is that weird to think about it? Uh-huh. Yeah, it is, but it's a struggle when we look at this. So I just really want to again emphasize that not only here in Numbers, this is the beginning, but when we get to the book of Joshua, there's going to be other accounts where entire cities are slaughtered. But again, why? Genesis 15. Their sin was full. God had put up with them for all this time. Now think about how long did God put up with them? How long were the children of Israel in captivity? 400 years. 400 years. Did God send prophets or messengers or something to these people trying to get them to turn around? We don't know for a fact, but we do find some examples in the Old Testament where some of the prophets, Jonah, were sent to Nineveh, trying to save the Ninevites. And again, Jonah didn't want to preach to them because why? Yeah, he didn't want them to be saved. But he knew them, and remember, he will quote that passage we studied in Exodus, where he says, God is a God of mercy, long-suffering. And Jonah quotes that. He said, I knew you were a God that was long-suffering. 400 years to us, I can't even begin to imagine because I'm not going to live that long. But to God, it's an afternoon, right? It's nothing. If 1,000 years is one day, and 100 years, that's 1/4 of a day or something along that line. You know what I'm trying to say? God is long-suffering. God puts up with a lot. One of the things that I emphasize is that we have got to try somehow, some way or another, to get God's view of things. Okay? Let's take about a 5-minute break and we'll come back. All righty? Let me pause. Let me figure out how to pause the recording. Pick up now with the division of the plunder. We spent a little bit of time talking about that, and we will be talking about it some more as we continue on. But we start now, we see that they were to keep alive for themselves the young girls who have not known a man intimately. The men were to stay outside the camp for a period of 7 days. Chapter 31, verse 19, again, because they were unclean. And they had to be clean, and they had to purify themselves on the third day. The seventh day, they had to purify their garments, everything made of leather, everything woven of goat's hair, and everything made of wood. Now, this starts setting the tone of what's going to happen as they start conquering the Canaanites. Again, the children of Israel are going to have to go through this purification process. The soldiers are, as they do everything along this line. Excuse me. This is the ordinance of the law, verse 21, which the Lord commanded Moses. The gold, silver, bronze, iron, tin, and lead, everything that can endure fire shall be put through the fire, and it shall be clean, and it shall be purified with the water of purification. But if it cannot endure fire, you put it through the water, and you shall wash your clothes on the seventh day and be clean, and afterward you may come back into the camp. So from here on out, this is the way they were going to have to do this every time they fought in battles. Now, how does this division of property work out? Obviously, the Israelites had won a decisive battle. You find them coming back outside the camp. You find them in this situation, half of the spoils were to be given to the soldiers. For their share, the soldiers were to give tribute to the Lord 1 out of every 500. 1 out of every 500. Why? Because they actually were fighting in the battle. But if you were a part of the people that did not go into battle, then you would have to give 1 out of 50. 1 out of 50. So all this stuff would have been split up. The army, the soldiers would have gotten 1 out of 500 of everything. Okay? In other words, they would only have to they would pay a lot less than the children of Israel in their part of the booty here, because that's for their upkeep. And so they counted their men, and they found that none of them were missing in battle. The gold brought to Moses weighed 16,750 shekels. That's about 420 pounds. Gold now, the last I saw, was going about $1,600 an ounce. Okay. So you start figuring 420 times 16 times $1,600. That's a chunk of change. That's a chunk of change. Okay. And so now this is what we're talking about, the 36. And again, he talks about all the various offerings. The Lord's tribute of the sheep were 675. The cattle were 36,000, of which the Lord's tribute was 72. You see, they're giving all of this to the Lord as they have been required to do so, all the gold. And so now we come to the end of chapter 31. I'm going on into chapter 32. And here's where we have an interesting discussion. Okay, go ahead.
What did they do with all those young men?
Obviously, they brought them up as if they were Israelites, and this would allow their sons to marry them later.
So it became kind of like proselyte.
In a sense, yeah. Or probably more the ideal of,
Kind of like an adopted person.
perhaps, or maybe more the ideal of a slave. Okay. And again, we get into that discussion about people owning people. These were different times, and we try in our country to judge people by our mores and standards of today. But slavery, listen, slavery is still going on all over the world and in this country. Just listen to the whole discussion of the sex slaves that's going on in this country, sex slavery. And I mean, it's going on. It needs to be stamped out. The Department of Justice have done a lot more about it lately. It seems like the last few months than it seems like they've done in a long time, done more sting operations, but slavery is still going on all over the world. And again, it's another one of those things that we may talk a good talk, but will we ever wipe it out? I don't think so until the Lord comes again. The Lord will. But there's that idea. And again, we struggle with that. We struggle with the way that's because that's not according to our way of thinking. We supposedly are thinking better than that. But let's also look at it this way. They killed all the adults So all that's left is what? The kids. They killed all the boy kids. So then you have a whole group of girls that are going to have to be raised up or killed, one or the other. So you see these things come into play there. This is why God says these things in this respect. And yeah, they become somewhat slaves too. All right. But they could literally become proselytes, as you're trying to suggest. Okay. Any other thoughts, comments? All right. I don't have all the answers to all the questions. I'm just trying to deal with what we can find from the text. And we still struggle with that, right? We still struggle with a lot of that. But I think it's important for us to at least try to sit down and talk it out to try to figure out what we can about it instead of just glossing over it like we often do. All right. Now we come to chapter 32. The children of Reuben and the children of Gad had a very great multitude of livestock. When they saw the land of Jazer and the land of Gilead, that the region was a place for livestock, the children of Gad and the children of Reuben came and spoke to Moses, to Eleazar, and to the leaders of the congregation, saying, and he gives them these names, this country which the Lord defeated before the congregation of Israel is a land for livestock. Your servants have livestock. If we found favor in your sight, let this land be given to your servants as a possession. Do not take us over Jordan. Okay. They didn't really want to cross the Jordan River into Canaan land. We've got livestock. This is good land for livestock. It's a legitimate request up to a point. Moses jumped to a conclusion. What does he say? Shall your brethren go to war while you sit here? That's a good sermon comment anyway. How many times, think about it in this respect, shall Christians go to church every Sunday and not get involved in the battle for the souls of men? Shall your brethren sit here while everybody else is doing the fighting and everybody else is doing the work? Good lesson there. That's another question or another point to bring in. He mentions the point. Will you discourage the children of Israel, heart of the children of Israel, from going over into the land? Thus your fathers did when I sent them away from Kadesh Barnea to see the land. And he starts comparing them to what? The spies. He said, you're just like the spies. Now, every time I've read this, I think that Moses did jump to some conclusions here. And later it gets all worked out. But you also have to ask this very, very valid question. Was that really what God wanted? For them to be split up that way? Now, as it works out, and I had never considered it from this viewpoint. Again, I read a lot of commentaries and so forth, and I came across this commentary, again by Burton Kaufman, that suggests the idea that this was not what God wanted. They made some promises they did not keep. All right, and it's interesting as well. We just looked back a couple of chapters ago that if you make a promise, you've got to keep your word. But we're actually going to see that they didn't keep their promise in every sense of the term. All right? Moses was upset because they thought they were going to just sit back and idle in this area and not go to war. They chose to remain in Transjordan. They were discouraging the others from claiming the promised land. The wandering in the wilderness came because of the discouragement of the 10 spies. And so what they're doing is the same thing that those 10 spies did. And they're discouraging the children of Israel. And so what does he go on to say? He says, thus your fathers did when I sent them from the land of Kadesh. And they saw the land. They discouraged the heart of the children of Israel so that they did not go into the land. The Lord's anger was aroused on that day, and he swore an oath, saying, none of the men who came from Egypt from 20 years old, except for Jacob and Caleb. So the Lord's anger was aroused against Israel, and he made them wander in the wilderness 40 years until all that generation. And look, you, he says, verse 14, have risen in your father's place, a brood of sinful men, to increase still more the fierce anger of the Lord against Israel. For if you turn away from following him, he will once again leave them in the wilderness, and you will destroy all these people. So in essence, he says, you know, you're going to be the ones at fault, and you're going to cause this, another generation, to perish. He jumps on them, and I mean, he just really lays it out there. But they said, well, look, we're going to build sheepfolds in our cities for our little ones, but we ourselves will be armed, ready to go before the children of Israel till we brought them to their place. And their little ones will dwell in the fortified cities because of the inhabitants of the land. We will not return to our homes till every one of the children of Israel has received his inheritance. We will not inherit with them on the other side because our inheritance has fallen to us. So he said, we're going to send our armed men over. Now, the importance of this is I want you to remember this book of Numbers is talking about what? Numbering the soldiers, right? So here again, you have a departure from God's will based on the same grounds that the other people had made, disobedience, and no, we're not going to do that. We don't want to do that. We don't want to take the land. We don't want to be a part of the Canaan land. We want to stay right here where we are. And here's what's interesting. Whenever you read about the roster of the men of war after the 40 years, okay, remember they recounted them back in Numbers chapter, let me see, where is this? The second census of Israel. There's 3 tribes. What tribes were they? Remember? There was the tribe of Gad, the tribe of Reuben, and half the tribe of Manasseh. So, whenever you go back and you start looking at the tribe of Gad, second census, let me see. All righty. The number of the tribe of Gad was 40,500. These are the soldiers, okay? All right, so let's try to do a little bit of math here. 45,000, how much? Let's see. 40, let's see, the families of the sons of Gad according to 40,500. Okay, I'm sorry. 40,500. All right. The Reubenites. I misspelled that, so please forgive me. Let me see, where's the Reubenites in verse 20, chapter 26? Zebulun, Simeon, the sons of Gad, the sons of Judah, the sons of Ishkar, sons of Zebulun, the sons of Manasseh. The family of them were 52,000. Manasseh were 52,700. That's Manasseh. Okay. And Reuben, where's Reuben here? Benjamin, Dan, Asher, Naphtali. Where is Reuben? Oh, Reuben's the firstborn. Okay. 43,730. 43,730. All right, let's do some math. 0, 3, 14, and 5 is 19, right? Carry your 1. It's 5, 6, and 8. You've got 100. 8 and 5 is 13. 136,000 men. Now we have to take half the tribe of Manasseh. So half of Manasseh is what? 52,700 divided by 2 is what?
26,350.
Thank you. 26,350. Man, thank you so much. I'd have done the long division. Okay. So let's just, okay, let's subtract 26,350. All right, do your math, and that's 8, and that's 5, 0. You got 110,580. All right, now, here's the point I want to try to make. These 2 tribes and half the tribe of Manasseh, that's the total number of fighting men. But when we go a little bit further, in Joshua chapter 4, verse 13, in Joshua 4:13, Joshua says this, what we read in the book of Joshua. And again, Joshua is where they're starting to do that, so they left the half tribes there. And in 4:13, 40,000 prepared for war. The men of Reuben, the men of Gad, and half the tribe of Manasseh crossed over armed. About 40,000 prepared for war, crossed over before the Lord for battle. Instead of 110,000 going over, 40,000 went over. They didn't keep their promise. Now, God still used what he did and still did what he did. But the bottom line is that you're looking at, obviously, 70,000 armed men stayed at home on the other side of the Jordan. 70,000 of them stayed over on the other side. Only 40,000 went with the children of Israel to conquer the land. They didn't keep their promise. Isn't that interesting? I never realized that. I never really realized that. But he does emphasize that idea, and it just emphasizes to me that they didn't keep their promise, and as a result of that, it became a problem a little bit later on. Part of driving out all the land of Canaan is they were to drive out all the original inhabitants. And part of the reason for that is God did not want them to intermarry with the Canaanites, did he? And so the reality is you had 2.5 tribes. That was a very serious loss of manpower. And that's the reason why, as you pick up with the book of Judges, guess what happens? There's still people in the land that have not been conquered. And it's those people in the land that cause the children of Israel, or tempts the children of Israel, to start worshiping these other gods. Promises made, promises not kept. And as I said, I never really realized this until I was studying this. It's like, wow, I never thought of that before. And I never saw that before. So again, I've learned something new every day, and I hope you do as well as we think about that. Here, he's emphasizing this idea of this second. Okay, so we get back on chapter 32, and again, they make these promises. They make these promises that they did not keep. Moses said, verse 32, chapter 32, verse 20, if you do this thing, if you arm yourselves before the Lord for the war, and all your armed men cross over the Jordan before the Lord, the land is subdued before the Lord, then afterward you may return and be blameless before the Lord and before Israel, and this land shall be your possession before the Lord. But if you do not do so, take note, you have sinned against the Lord, and here's the old statement, and be sure that your sin will what? Find you out. So he says, build those cities, do what you proceeded out of your mouth. Your servants, listen, verse 25, your servants will do as my Lord commands. Our lives and our little ones, our wives, our flocks, and all our livestock. But your servants will cross over, every man armed for war before the Lord of battle, just as my Lord says. So, what can we learn from all of that? What do we think about from all of that? Promises made. Didn't we emphasize the idea that if you make a vow, you've got to keep those vows? Promises made, promises not kept. So, he gave, at your verse 33, Moses said, if the children of Gad and the children of Reuben cross over the Jordan with you, he's talking to Joshua here, every man armed for battle. Again, there's that idea, every man armed for battle. And the land is subdued, you shall give them the land of Gilead as a possession. But if they do not cross over, and then the children of Gad and the children of Reuben answered, as the Lord has said to your servants, so will we do. We will cross over armed before the Lord. So Moses gave to the children of Gad, the children of Reuben, half the tribe of Manasseh, the land of the Amorites and the kingdom of Og, the land with all of its cities, Beth Nimrah and Beth Haran. And the children of Reuben built Eliab and built these. The children of Reuben starts rebuilding these cities. The children of Machir, and talks about all these different cities that they rebuilt, okay, and so forth. So, interesting ideas there.
Now, is this land they're trying to keep on
East side of the Jordan.
Mm-hmm. Is that part of the land that they took from
It was the land of the Midianites
Moabites
and the Midianites and the Moabites. Absolutely. Absolutely.
So they didn't have to defeat another group of people to take it.
No, it's all that group has already been defeated. And that's why they were, I mean, when it came down to fighting and getting the rest of the Canaanites out of the land, they weren't helping a whole lot. Not with 70,000 men left back in that land. 70,000 men, that doesn't make a good army by itself, right? So it says a lot. And like I said, I never realized that until I really sat down and started studying it and saw that in that respect. So we're coming to that point, and that's where, and actually as you go on from there, we see that these 40,000 go in there and they help, and they obviously do what they can, and they did a good job with it, because at the end, after Joshua had conquered the land, these men do go back. This is the story of the book of Joshua. They go back, they build a altar. The children of Israel thought they were building an altar to another god. Remember that whole story in the latter part of the book of Joshua? And they had to come back and say, no, we're still going to worship God, and we're still going to worship the God of Israel. But that's again, extremely interesting as I was looking about this. Chapter 33 is a travelogue, and I'm not going to go into a lot of details here because a lot of these places, and history as well as archaeology is telling us more and more and more about where some of these places may have been. And you might look at some maps where we could see where those places are if you wanted to actually look it up. But there's not that great deal of there's not that really huge, clear idea of where all these places were in all these situations. So, I mean, there are some places like Kibbutz Hatava, they might have some ideas about, but we really can't say. But this is a verse 30 or chapter 33 is just a travel log of where all they went. All righty. And again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. All righty. If I did, I'd probably put everybody to sleep. All righty. So, in the latter part of that passage starts in verse 50. The Lord spoke to Moses in the land of Moab by the Jordan, across from Jericho. Now here you have Jericho mentioned. And remember, whenever the children of Israel actually cross the land, what's the first city they take? It's Jericho. So I mean, seriously, they are looking over and seeing the city of Jericho. That's how close they were now. They're that close. He says, when you have crossed the Jordan in the land of Canaan, you shall drive out all the inhabitants of the land from before you, destroy all their engraved stones, destroy all their molded images, demolish all their high places. So what did God say? Destroy the idols, destroy the stones, destroy everything. Because you shall demolish it, you shall dispossess the inhabitants of the land and dwell in it, for I've given you the land to possess. And you shall divide the land by lot as an inheritance among the families. To the larger one, you give a larger inheritance. To the smaller, you shall give a smaller inheritance. There, everyone's inheritance shall be whatever falls to him by lot. And again, when you go back to the second census of Israel, you would have to look and see which one of the tribes was bigger and which one was not. It seems like somewhere, I know earlier, I gave you this, I think, of the differences between before and after. Yeah, I did. Or I think I did. There's a chart here. Maybe I did not give it to you. But like Reuben, before the wandering, they had 46,500 men. After the 40 years, it was 43,000. So they lost 2,770 men. We remember that Simeon went from 59,300 to 22,000. So they went down 63%. Manasseh went from 32,000 at the beginning to 52,000. So they gained 20,000. That's adding 63%. So depending on, and again, remember, half the tribe of Manasseh is on the other side. So you have every one of these adding. Benjamin went from 35,400 to 45,000. So they increased 29%. So every one of them would be allotted by how big their soldiers were. And obviously, if you had every soldier had a wife and a child, you would have a bigger. So that allotment would fit in along that line. And he says, listen, now he's warning them here. He said, some of you will have a smaller inheritance. Some of you will have a bigger inheritance. He says, if you do not drive out the inhabitants of the land before you, it shall be that those whom you let remain shall be irritants in your eyes and thorns in your side. Even here, he warned them, if you do not drive the inhabitants out of the land, they're going to cause you to sin. And so he says, they shall harass you in the land where you dwell. It shall be that what I will do to you as I thought to do to them. Now notice what God says. I will do to you as I thought to do to them. Why? Because they were going to be influenced by the world and not do what God says. So, as we start looking at that, did they do what God said? Did they obey his word? No. Because again, as we get to the book of Judges, chapter 1, you see that they did not do it. And God tells them this. And again, you find that the children of Israel were warned about this. As you come to Judges chapter 1, there's some of them there, but notice Judges chapter 1, verse 27. Manasseh did not drive out the inhabitants of Bethshean and the villages. And it came to pass when Israel was strong, they put the Canaanites under tribute, but they did not completely drive them out. Ephraim did not drive out the Canaanites who dwelt in Gezer. So the Canaanites dwelt in Gezer among them. Zebulun did not drive out the inhabitants of Kitron or the inhabitants of Nahalal. So the Canaanites dwelt among them and were put under tribute. Nor did Asher drive out the inhabitants, nor the Naphtali, nor the Amorites forced the children of Dan into the mountains, so they would not allow them to come down to the valley. The Amorites were determined to dwell in Mount Heres. And so you see Israel's disobedience. And so God says in chapter 2 of Judges, he says, I led you out of Egypt. I swore to bring you this land. I will never break my covenant with you. You shall make no covenant with the inhabitants of the land. You have not obeyed my voice. Why have you not done this? Or why have you done this? I will not drive them out because you didn't keep your part of the bargain. I'm not going to keep my part of the bargain, God says. And so he says, the angel of the Lord spoke these words to the children of Israel, and they all lifted up their voices and wept. And so then you begin to find in chapter 2, verse 11, the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord and served the Baals. They forsook the Lord God of their fathers and they followed other gods from among the gods of the people who were around them, and they bowed down to them, and they provoked the Lord to anger. So Judges then starts telling us about a cycle where in the cycle in the book of Judges, and I don't want to belabor this point, but the children of Israel were serving God. Then they would sin. God would
cry out.
And they would cry out. They would sin. They would repent. But actually, before that, whenever they sinned, God would what? They would put them under, I just went blank of a word I'm looking for, but I can't think of it. They would, oppression, that's it. They would send an oppressor. They would repent and ask God's forgiveness. Then God would what? Send a judge, a deliverer. And this again is another study, but the deliverer, a lot of times, were not much better than the people. Think about Samson. He was a great deliverer. What was he morally like? Won't even go down that road, okay? And then they would come back and serve God again. There's this cycle that goes on. That's what the books of Judges is all about. We kind of do the same thing today, don't we? When things are going good, we don't think so much about God. We engage in sin. We now know where we're in the bad situation we're in because we have sin in our lives. Lord, we're sorry. We apologize. Please forgive us. God will deliver us, and we serve God until that just seems to be a pattern. It just seems to be a pattern. So, get back to Numbers chapter 34. Well, I'm getting close. I'm getting close to the end of. Wow. Okay, I didn't realize this. Okay, I didn't realize how close I was. All righty. Comments, questions, thoughts up to this point in time? Okay. Yeah. Numbers 34. The appointed boundaries of Canaan. He gives us a rough estimate, and I think most of us have seen the maps. You probably got them in the back of your Bibles. Most of us do. But in essence, it looks something like this, easy to kind of remember. But you have the Mediterranean Sea. All right. We remember that it kind of goes up here, and then it kind of comes back down through here, in this area here. This is going back to Egypt here. And so this becomes the land of Israel. And then you have the Jordan River. And let's say the Jordan River is right here. And then you have this part right in here where Reuben, Gad, and so forth there. Dan will be up here. You'll have Judah back down in this area here. This is roughly where Jerusalem's going to be, Tyre and Sidon and things along that. One of the things that they do mention is the fact that this coastland here, the children of Israel never had that coastland. It was always in other people's possession, the Philistines or somewhere or another. So they never really had the coastland that much.
Was it had been promised to them though?
Yeah, but again, they weren't always diligent in driving these people out. And as a result of that, this was, and again, when you look at a lot of the maps, it shows that. But again, you look at these maps and I know one of the commentaries I read said they never really had the coastland under control. And all the time they were there, they never had that under control.
Now, I've seen more than one map where I guess later David took some northern territory outside of
Right.
what was the original promise.
Mm-hmm.
So you could see different maps of
At different times.
because at different times.
That's right.
But well, I guess the extra things that David took were not part of the original promise.
No. But like when he defeated the Philistines, he would gain their territory. So the Philistines would be down in here. So during the time of David, his stuff would go on down here. This would go on down a little bit further. Okay. And Solomon at one time had conquered all the way up here. In fact, they mentioned the idea that he had conquered all the way back into the Tigris and Euphrates River Valley. So he had that land that far up. But it didn't last that long because why? His sins. And so then everything started collapsing then on him once again. So it's an interesting idea. We can't really know all of the definite boundaries of Canaan. Again, we struggle to try to figure all this out. We do know that there was leaders from every tribe to divide the land. The Lord spoke to Moses saying, these are the names of the men that shall help you do it, Eleazar, Joshua. And so they start taking these different men. And so as they begin to split up all this land of Canaan here, they then have to work it out who gets what, where, and how. Okay? Different maps show different ways where these all happen. Judah mainly gets this southern portion down here. Judah was the biggest tribe at one point. So, and again, this is from where the tribe of, this is where David comes from, Solomon comes from. All the tribes of, all the kings come from this tribe. All the kings of Judah come from this tribe. Okay, I want to emphasize that. Another thing that should come into play here is there's two major players in this area. It's going to be the descendants of Ephraim and then the descendants of Judah. Now, Ephraim, when the kingdom is divided, after what Solomon did, the kingdom is divided. The northern part is called what? Israel. And the southern part is Judah. And who is in charge usually here in Israel? Ephraimites. So again, and who's in charge here is the Judites. So now you have actually a kingdom divided.
There were two tribes in the southern kingdom.
Two tribes. But then there was also a lot of the Levites. Whenever the northern kingdom split off from the southern kingdom, book of First Kings or First Samuel. It's the First Kings. I just went totally blank. Please forgive me. I can't remember that king's name.
Rehoboam?
No, that was Rehoboam was the southern. The northern king was an upstart. Okay, we talk about Solomon. We come to 1 Samuel chapter 11, where his heart turns from the Lord. You have Jeroboam. And then, now Jeroboam takes over here. And what's he do? He automatically starts changing every bit of God's laws. Makes two different altars instead of worshiping in Jerusalem. And puts anybody as a priest instead of a Levitical priest. So the Levites stay here in Judah by and large. And this nation here then starts, there was not one good king in the northern tribes. Not one. When you come down here, there was about 6 or 7. And that's the reason why they lasted longer. But like I said, that's Hebrew history 2 or 3. Okay?
When God made a promise to Abraham that he was going to give him all the land that he could see,
Mm-hmm.
I know, I guess distances are like shorter, I guess, in there, like maybe, 100 miles went a long way through Israel. I think the whole thing in Israel one time is you could fit it across Georgia pretty much.
Yeah.
Not much bigger than that.
Mm-hmm.
But it seems hard to imagine from one place you could see all these boundaries. Or you see part of it, like I never quite understood that, but you could, some point where you could sit and see all the land they're going to get. It seemed like they got more than you could physically see from one place.
Mm-hmm. Whenever Moses dies, and we'll come to that at the very end in Deuteronomy, but when Moses dies, he takes him up on Mount Hor, I think it is, H-O-R, and he sees all the land. I myself have wondered the same thing, Carrie. How could he see all the land of Israel just from that one mountain? Either A, this was an extremely high mountain, or B, and again, I'm weird, okay, so y'all understand that. But I wonder if there was some way that God panoramically showed him everything. In other words, in a vision or something along that line, or maybe he was there on Mount Hor, but God in some way or another let him see everything that he missed out on. So
yeah, it has to be unexplained, but an explanation.
Yeah,
we don't know.
That's exactly right. And I don't know of any place. They haven't really, from what I understand, I could be wrong. I don't think that there's any one specific place where they would say this is Mount Hor, where he would have been able to see everything. It's just like, where's his body? God buried it, and God knows where it is. So again, we don't know, and we just have, this is where a lot of speculations start coming in. But it is a huge area, and it is, like you said, could fit in possibly in the state of Georgia, lengthwise anyway.
When God made the promise, he said, I'll give you this land forever.
Uh-huh.
But I guess they don't have it forever, because forever in the Old Testament doesn't really mean
forever and ever and ever and ever and ever.
It means for a long time.
Yeah.
Is the explanation I've heard.
That's right.
and that the promise had conditions and being not kept that can nullify the promise.
That's exactly right.
And so people that still think today the Jews are entitled to all this today because God gave it to them forever, that's a false thought process.
Right, right. So that's the idea. And again, you start seeing even early on the controversy between the Ephraimites and the Judites. And so as we go through that, and again, remember Ephraim, you had the oldest was Reuben, Simeon, Levi. Ephraim was the oldest son of who? Joseph. Joseph had two sons, Ephraim and who? Manasseh. Okay? And I think I may have referenced this before. You see, here's part of the problem, teaching Bible classes and all this other stuff. I'm not sure where I tell who what. Okay, so if I said it before, just bear with me. There's some debate because Joseph was the son of, thank you, Jacob, or Israel's wife, or Rachel, his favorite wife. Some people thought that maybe he would have given the birthright to Joseph. Instead, what did he do? He gave it to Judah. Now, Reuben was the oldest. Simeon and Levi were the next oldest. Reuben laid with his father's concubine. That caused him not to be able to do that. Simeon and Levi had been guilty of destroying the city of Shechem because of the rape of Dinah. So the next one on the list would be Judah. And Judah then receives the supposed kingdom. But some people do suggest the idea that because Joseph was born of his favorite wife, he may have gotten that. But notice what happened. He takes it and splits Joseph's family, and Joseph's family gets two parts of the inheritance because he takes Joseph's sons, Reuben and Manasseh, not Reuben and Manasseh, Ephraim and Manasseh, and gives him, those two boys, his part of the inheritance. So he got double portion because he was Rachel's son. Does that make sense?
It's all over my head.
All right. The birthright usually went always to the oldest son. The oldest son would have been Reuben. But again, because of what he did to his father, he did not get it. Simeon and Levi did not get it. The promise of the king did go to Judah, because that was the next boy down. But did Judah receive the birthright? It doesn't seem like it. It seems like Joseph actually received the birthright because his two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, gets double. The birthright suggested the idea that the oldest son would have the majority of the inheritance and take care of the family, the entire family, with that inheritance. Okay? But he would get the majority of it. So by giving or splitting Joseph's two sons, using Ephraim and Manasseh as his, claiming them as his, he gave Joseph the birthright. He gave him 2 times when everybody else just got 1/12, right? So actually, the descendants of Joseph got 1/6. And so in that respect, that's what a lot of people do get. And that's perhaps part of the reason why Ephraim and Judah are going to be at odds with one another throughout here. This is another dynamic that's worth a study in and of itself, is going into the study of the family dynamic and how this family that starts off with Jacob, Leah, and Rachel becomes the massive children of Israel, and how the interplay with one another Why did the boys get upset with Joseph? Because he was daddy's favorite son, right? And what did they do? They were going to kill him, but instead they sold him into Egypt. But you see, God was looking down the line, and through Joseph, he saved the family, right? So when Jacob is dying, he takes Joseph's sons and said, they're mine. Now you get 2 parts of the inheritance instead of just one. So there's something I think that's, that really emphasizes that idea. And it's really a great deal to study about. All righty. I could go on for a while, but anyway, it does emphasize the problems here that's going to manifest themselves later whenever Solomon dies. All righty. Let's see, where was I? Chapter 35. The cities of refuge. The cities of refuge. The Lord spoke to Moses in the plains of Moab by the Jordan across from Jericho, saying, command the children of Israel that they give the Levites cities to dwell in from the inheritance of their possession, and you shall give the Levites common land around the cities. They shall have the cities to dwell in, and their common land shall be for their cattle, for their herds, and for all their animals. The common land of the cities which you give the Levites shall extend from the wall of the city outward 1,000 cubits all around. You shall measure outside the city on the east side 2,000 cubits, south side 2,000 cubits, west side 2,000 cubits, and on the north side 2,000 cubits. And you're going to give them, among all these different cities that they're going to have, 6 of them shall be appointed as cities of refuge. Now there's a lot of different, the cities you will give to the Levites shall be 48. 6 of them will be the cities of refuge. Now, what do y'all remember about the cities of refuge?
Kill somebody accidentally.
Accidentally.
Then you can be safe.
You could stay in that city, right, until the high priest dies. But also at that time, you would have the situation where there would be a trial. There would have to be proof. Beyond any shadow of a doubt, they would have to be proof that it was an accident. It was manslaughter. But if it was actual murder, then what? They would be delivered up to the avenger of blood. All righty? What's also interesting, and I didn't realize this again, and this part of the reason why I love studying and trying to teach, because I did not realize this. A lot of the pagan temples had sanctuaries around their temples where people who committed crimes could come because they were under the God's protection at that time. And so literally, the bottom line is, if you were going to a pagan temple, you, in a sense, as you were going up there, you may be very well taking your life in hand because it had a bunch of criminals all the way around the temple. How great. Well, at least we know where the concentration of them are, but going to worship your God, you're going to have to walk through a bunch of criminals that may have killed and all this other stuff. That's not cool. I don't really know that I want to do that. God does it. The accused would stay in the city until the trial was held. Probably the city in which the murder was committed. So a lot of times he might be in this city of refuge, but would stay. Either they brought all of the parties involved to the city of refuge and they had the trial there, or they may have taken the man that was accused back to the place where it happened, had the trial there. I'm not sure. We're not sure exactly how that played out. If he was found guilty of premeditated murder, he was immediately executed. Otherwise, like you said, he was staying in the city of refuge until, if he was found guilty of manslaughter, he stayed in the city until the high priest died. And then he was allowed to go out. The avenger of blood. This word is goel. This is the near kinsman. The near kinsman would be the person that is part of the family. So if I murdered, God forbid, but if I murdered Carrie, for example, just using this as an example, then Carrie's brother or Carrie's son would come and he would be the Goel, the avenger of blood. He would be the one that would take my life. He would be the one that would take my life. This near kinsman would collect debts owed to the deceased. He would buy a kinsman out of slavery. He would sell himself, that compelled him to sell himself and buy the property, keep it, pass him out of the family. He would be the one that that would contract a levirate marriage. And a levirate marriage is a brother of a deceased man is obligated to marry his brother's wife and bring up seed in that situation. So here, these are the proceedings of refuge. More than one witness would have to be called to be executed for murder. There would be no ransom for murder. No ransom. The judges had some discretion in certain capital cases, but not when the offense was murder. Why? Bloodshed pollutes the land. So God says, only by the shed blood of the murderer could there be an atonement for the land. The land would become defiled if it had blood in it. So again, failing to execute murderers polluted and defiled the land. So just chew on that one for a few moments. Think about that a little bit. Our failure sometimes when it comes to murderers and execution, this is an Old Testament principle. I don't want to belabor this point, but the Bible does sanction the death penalty, even in the New Testament. Again, we think about Romans chapter 13, where in Romans chapter 13, Paul was talking to the brethren there, and he says, let souls be subject to the governing authorities. There is no authority except from God, and the authorities that exist are appointed by God. Whoever resists the authority resists the ordinance of God, and those who resist will bring judgment on themselves. Rulers are not a terror to good works, but to evil. Do you want to be unafraid of the authority? Do what is good. He is God's minister for good. If you do evil, be afraid. He does not bear the sword in vain. He is God's minister and avenger to execute wrath on him who practices evil. So this sanctions capital punishment. In the Old Testament it does. In the New Testament it does. But again, you know what I'm talking about, and I don't want to belabor this point too much, but a lot of times today it's because sentence is not executed speedily. It encourages more crimes like that. Years ago, people would be publicly hanged. You know, and everybody would go to the hanging, right? Now it's become more civilized, for lack of a better term. And the execution may take place after 30 years of appeals, may take place at midnight with just a few witnesses. That's all. If we practiced it more often, would it stop the crime rate?
I think it slowed it down.
It would definitely slow it down. If we would practice it more consistently. Have there been mistakes made in bringing people to judgment? Yes, they're going to be made. People lie at trials. Really? Yeah. Lawyers will always twist something to make it somehow okay, right? But the bottom line out of the whole thing is that, again, failure to execute the murderers polluted the land. Punishment is not taken care of. So people are actually thinking they can get away with it. And that's what's sad about it all. I don't know how many of you, I've stopped watching it. I really have. I just gotten to the point where I used to watch the first 48 a lot. Where these guys are trying to catch the murderer within the first 48 hours because supposedly the being able to find the evidence necessary is just, it's not there. And I would watch this, and these guys would, a lot of them were drugs, but they would be sentenced to 5 or 10 years. They would plead down from murder to manslaughter. 5 or 10 years in prison, get out in 2.5 for good behavior, and go out and kill again. There's something wrong with that. There's something wrong with that. I think we've gone from one extreme to the other, like we often do in this country and in the world. We go from one extreme to the other because we're afraid of getting the wrong person punished so much that we don't punish the ones that we definitely know are wrong. And that brings into the whole other discussion about jails, and does that really bring about any kind of changes? Does that really rehabilitate? You know, the emphasis was, years ago it was on punishment, now it's rehabilitation. But how many of these folks get out and are rehabilitated? And you also got to think about the fact that even society itself is going to have a problem with somebody that gets out of jail for something like that, because they're not going to want to hire a murderer. I wouldn't. I don't know anybody's going to want to take you into, you know, and let you help us out in that respect. So again, what do? Again, there's all these questions that come into our minds and our hearts whenever we think about this. I think we have become so, I don't want to use the word compassionate, I don't think that's the word, but we're so afraid of hurting or killing the wrong people that we allow people to live that are going to get out and they're going to keep on doing it. Justice is not done. God knew that this is the way it needed to be handled. But again, we in our enlightened society say, well, you know, God didn't know what he was talking about. Oh, wait a minute, that's how I started the class off, right? Because a lot of people do say that idea. So there you have the cities of refuge. All right, let's look at chapter 36. We'll finish this up. This chapter 36 goes back to what we studied earlier in Numbers chapter 26, where the marriage of the female heirs. Remember the idea that, did I say chapter 26? Chapter 36, Numbers 26, 29. 26, 29. You had the sons of Manasseh. All right, Numbers 27, the inheritance laws dealing with the daughters of Zelophehad. So here we come to the very end of the book of Numbers, and the chief fathers of the children of Machir, Gilead, the son of Manasseh, of the families of the sons of Joseph, came near and spoke before Moses and before the leaders, saying, the Lord commanded to give the land as an inheritance. And my Lord was commanded by the Lord to give the inheritance of our brother Zelophehad to his daughters. If they married to any one of the sons of the other tribe, they're going to take part of our inheritance. And when the Jubilee comes, their inheritance will be added to the inheritance of the tribe which they marry. So he commanded the children of Israel, what the tribe of Joseph speaks is right. So let them marry whom they think best, but they marry only within the family of their father's tribe. So in other words, they were of the children of Manasseh, so they could only marry somebody in the children of Manasseh. That way, the inheritance would not pass to someone else. And so the daughters of Zelophehad did just that. For Mahlah, this would be a good question on a test. What are the daughters' names of Zelophehad? How many of you are going to remember that one? Mahlah, Tirzah, Hoglah, Milcah, and Noah. You might remember the last one, but most of the time we're going to think about the ark, right? We're not going to think about a daughter of Zelophehad. So they were married into the family of the children of Manasseh, the sons of Joseph, and their inheritance remained in the tribe of their father's family. These are the commandments and the judgments which the Lord commanded the children of Israel by the hand of Moses in the plains of Moab, across from Jericho. All righty. We will begin, God willing, next week in the book of Deuteronomy. Anybody have any questions on Numbers? Yes, it is. And being the longest one of the Pentateuch, it does cover a lot of material about a lot of different things. So I will try to make out the test this week, and we will go ahead and pick this up and start into the book of Deuteronomy and see where it goes from there.
For years, I kind of didn't ever really want to read it because of all the just facts. I couldn't see the point of all these facts. But once you get into it, it's really interesting.
And you've taken class twice now, haven't you? Didn't Randy teach it before? Yeah. So you've covered Leviticus. How many of us have loved Leviticus? How many of us really enjoy Leviticus? You know what I'm trying to say there? Most of us don't. We just kind of like, I'm bogged down there. And then Numbers also becomes a kind of an issue as well, but it kind of puts in all the details that was not covered in Leviticus. And then we're going to come, as I said, in Deuteronomy. All righty. I appreciate all of you so very, very much. Any questions or comments before we close tonight? Everything's as clear as it can be, right? Okay. All righty then. I keep dreaming. If I was a good teacher, I'd make it just as clear and everybody would understand it. But again, there's a lot of customs and so forth in this thing that really has a problem, and that's where we struggle with it. I appreciate all of you so very, very much. Have a good week. I'll try to get you the test this week. And if you have any other questions or comments, let me know. That's what I'm here for. You've got my email address, okay?
Have a good one,
guys. I love and appreciate all of you so very, very much. You encourage me. Thank you. Thank you.
Blessed to hear all this in this detail.
Have a good night.